Drafting Archetypes is brought to you by Game Grid Lehigh. Game Grid Lehigh is an amazing place to buy and sell Magic the Gathering singles. Whether you're building a new cube or crafting your new constructed deck, Game Grid Lehigh is the place to do it. Got a draft coming up with some friends? Buy some seal product here and get it quick. So click the referral link in the description to help out the show, and don't forget to use the code DRAFTPRO10 to get 10% off on your next order at gglehigh.com.
Hi everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to talk about Blink as an archetype in Double Masters. So, Double Masters is a little bit tricky archetypes-wise because there are so many viable archetypes, because you can play 2 colors or 3 colors or more than 3 colors, and most of the time you're going to play 3 colors, and all of the 3 color groups are supported. So there are a lot of different ways that you can draft the set. But I think that Blink as a strategy has ways that you can do it in a lot of different color combinations, and that it's very fundamentally strong regardless and drafted very similarly. So I think that my current approach to drafting Double Masters is very much based around kind of this core philosophy about Blink. And so I wanted to talk about how that works, why I'm drafting around it, what you want to prioritize, and just how I see Blink as an archetype. So fundamentally, I think most games of Double Masters are relatively grindy. There are aggressive decks that are strong and punish slow mana bases, but they are not the majority of decks. And there are pretty good answers to them. There's just a lot of very strong, efficient removal in the format. And while the good aggressive decks exist and have counterplay to that, most of the time, the slower decks, I think just density of cards are such that like your average game and average opponent is going to be more likely to be kind of in the like values kind of grindy space than like an aggressive matchup. And I also think that the like slower decks have the tools not to be well positioned against the aggressive decks. So I like to approach the format from trying to be more of a mid-range deck, and while I want to have tools to not get run over, I'm kind of expecting that the matchup's going to be a little bit more mid-rangey. So because there's a lot of good removal, I think that most of the time the games are about value. And I think that the best and easiest sources of value in the format are on creatures with enter the battlefield abilities. The key relevant commons for this claim and this strategy are Militia Bugler, the 2-mana 2/3 that finds another 2 or less power creature from the top 4 cards you library and puts it in your hand. Vigilance, 2 and a white. Aether Snipe, the evoke 4/4 that bounces something when you play it. Seeker's Squire, the 1 and a black 1/2 explore. Vampire Sovereign, the 3 black 3/4 flyer that drains your opponent for 3 when you play it. Annoyed Altasaur, the 7 mana Cascade Dinosaur. Elvish Rejuvenator, the 1/1 that finds a land. Webweaver Changeling, the 3/5 reach Changeling that gains 5 life if you have 3 creatures in your graveyard. Bloodwater Entity, the blue-red flying 2/2 prowess that puts an instant or sorcery from your graveyard on top of your deck when you play it. And Coiling Oracle, the 1/1 that draws a card and maybe puts a land into play. Key uncommons: Flicker Wisp, the 3/1 flyer that flickers something when it enters Wall of Omens, the 0/4 that draws a card, wall for 1 and a white. Muldrifter, the 5 mana 2/2 evoke, draw 2 cards. Skinrender, the black 2 3/3 that puts 3-1/-1 counters on something. Eternal Witness, 1 green 2/1 ETB, return something from your graveyard to your hand. Psychic Symbiont, the 6 mana 3/3 flyer that when it enters you draw a card and your opponent discards. Bloodbraid Elf, 3/2 haste Cascade for 4 in red-green. Bear's Companion, 5 mana Teamer 2/2 that makes a 4/4 when it enters the battlefield. Sultai Soothsayer, 5 mana Sultai 2/5 that looks at 4 cards and puts one of them in your hand and the others in your graveyard when you play it. All of those cards are very good. The uncommons are basically all appreciably better than the commons. The uncommons are all really impactful and really good to blink. The Cascade cards, I guess, are not good to blink. They're just like relevant value creatures to consider in terms of the format being about value creatures, not so much about utility of blink. So, given that there are all of these good creatures to blink, I am currently of the belief that Settle Beyond Reality is the strongest common in the set. I don't think it's very close. I think Settle Beyond Reality is the strongest common in the set by a lot. And I think that it's not the highest drafted common in the set, and that you should be drafting around being able to play Settle Beyond Realities that you see and maximizing its strength. Further, I think the combination of Eternal Witness and Settle Beyond Reality is so strong that the existence of that combo is enough that I'm fairly confident Eternal Witness is the best uncommon in the set, just because it makes that combo possible. I mean, the floor on Eternal Witness is very high. Eternal Witness is a great card, but then Eternal Witness Settle being just exile all of your opponent's creatures is really, 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 really good. And then both cards are independently strong, and you can, draw them in either order. You don't need to like keep Eternal Witness on the battlefield you do need to keep Eternal Witness on the battlefield, but you don't need to it's relatively hard to break up the combo, relatively easy to reassemble the combo. There are other ways to like get Eternal Witness back from your graveyard to reestablish the combo if like your opponent does kill your Eternal Witness. I think that that's just like a really, really good kind of like late game plan. So I don't like to pass either of those cards. For the most part, I'm looking to play 3 colors. I don't have like an exact 3 colors. Obviously, I want one of them to be white so that I can cast Settle Beyond Reality, but you can potentially play, 3-color Sultai or whatever, Sultai or Teamer, and then splash like a couple of Settle Beyond Realities and no other white cards. And that's how you would like use it with like Bear's Companion or Sultai Soothsayer. And I think it's like pretty reasonable to do that. You do need to like work reasonably hard to make your mana work if that's your plan. Easier if you can be white and 2 other colors. So I'm kind of like most looking to be white, least looking to be red, because red contributes the least to this like blink strategy. And then I think green and blue are slightly more likely than black, but really like any 3 of the non-red colors is like a space that I'm pretty happy with as far as like being this blink archetype, where like if I'm Sultai, then arguably maybe I'm not blink, maybe I'm just like Sultai value creatures, but also maybe I'm like also splashing for like some blink stuff. I think, the easiest and best way to like get all of the synergies working the way they're supposed to is Bant, but you don't have to be specifically Bant to still kind of like approach all of this in that way and prioritize these same cards. I didn't mention Relief Captain or Sensor Splicer among the key commons. They are conveniently white and have relatively impactful enter the battlefield abilities, but I think the rate is just not that impressive. I think the cards are a little bit weaker than the other value cards, and there are enough alternatives that I prefer not to like try to play those. If you end up short on stuff you want to blink and long on ways to blink, they're like fine. I also didn't mention the other blink enablers like the Smuggler and Mistmeadow Witch. Those cards are really strong if you have a bunch of blink stuff. They're relatively easy to kill, so I don't prioritize them like as highly as just like a good enters the battlefield ability creature. But they like if you get one of them with like any good value creature and your opponent can't break that up, then it's a really strong engine. In general, my pick order here is basically like busted rares over uncommon value creatures, over Settle Beyond Reality, over bounce lands, over common value creatures, over good removal, over cryptic spires, over like other creatures and card draw and filler stuff. That's a very broad, blunt way of looking at it. And obviously there's like a spectrum of quality of rares and quality of uncommon value creatures. And sometimes the rare is going to be better. Sometimes the uncommon value creature is going to be better, depending on exactly which ones you're comparing. But I think that if you like broadly follow bomb rares, uncommon value creatures, settle, double on color bounce lands, common value creatures, go to removal, cryptic spires, filler, in that order, you're going to be like basically on the right track for making this kind of deck work. As with my discussion about Myconid in Baldur's Gate, this is a very broad, very open-ended archetype. So I'm kind of forced to handle things in like pretty broad strokes. But I think that this is a format that has kind of a lot of interchangeable pieces and rewards a lot of like flexibility while having kind of a coherent overall strategic approach. So I think that like more specificity than this is both difficult and not very useful. It's all kind of like blunt, but similarly here, my big takeaway, this is actually kind of like more fundamental. Like in Baldur's Gate, I think Myconid is the most important common in green and like the backbone of green. Whereas Settle Beyond Reality is not merely the backbone of white. I think it's just the best common, and the best common in a pretty important way, where you want to like, because it's kind of easier to splash and because it's a 5-mana single pip card, you can splash it in kind of like weird spots. And so I think that like valuing it similarly to the way that I do really informs just like my strategy to the draft and evaluation of like all of the other cards in a way that I think is like pretty defining. Like it is, my approach to the format feels appreciably different having switched to prioritizing settle and flicker stuff versus just prioritizing anything other than that. I've had much better results since making this change and highly recommend it. So that's kind of my thesis, lecture, whatever here. And I'm going to turn it over to questions from chat as I'm now slightly more back in the production process that I've worked out for this podcast. Going to take a moment here while I wait for questions from chat to thank my newest patrons over at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. So Anga, John, and John, thank you very much for the support. For anyone else who is looking to support the podcast, get some features, get a little public thank you, etc., please check that out as I get back into the swing of this podcast. So chat, anything? What's important in the mirror? Okay. I don't know that I've played something that I would... So obviously, like, there are a lot of value creatures in the format, and so I play against, like, decks that have value creatures, but I don't feel like a lot of my opponents are approaching things quite the same way. I feel like I mostly play against, like, fast decks and mid-range decks, and I play against fewer decks that are like really kind of dedicated to like more of like an engine deck or dedicated to like value all the way down rather than just like, I don't know, more arbitrary cards. I think that as far as the mirror just being like mid-range decks and what matters there, I think getting ahead on cards and sticking something like going over the top. So like if you can stick Altasaur or whatever and it's bigger than your opponent's stuff and you can kill them with it, then that is going to win the game. But part of why Settle is so good is that it makes it very hard for, like, there are a lot of really powerful cards, and if you just exile them in a way that is like value positive, then it's easier to make the game continue to be about card advantage and card count rather than about like large objects. And as long as all of your cards are dedicated to building card advantage, and you can stop your opponent from making it about basically like card quality as an attribute that's distinct from card advantage and not about rate. So like most of the time card quality is a function of rate, because most of the time What matters is getting a lot of value for your mana. Once you've established that you're playing a really grindy game that's not like about tempo and is about like the total power of your cards, then there becomes another way of evaluating card quality, which is about impact. And some games of Double Masters are basically about who has the most impactful card. Like sometimes someone sticks like a dragon, like a Teneb type dragon. Where it's like, well, I played this thing, my opponent couldn't answer it, and it dominated the game and I won. And like those games are basically about card quality. As long as that card is unanswered, you're going to win the game. By prioritizing versatile, powerful answers, you make sure that your opponent doesn't win the game off of a single high impact card. As long as you can make sure that your opponent's card quality in terms of like total amount of impact doesn't trump your plan of card advantage, then you can win with numerical card advantage over potentially strong individual cards by just killing those cards while drawing cards, which is fundamentally what like settle plus value creatures is trying to do, is have an engine that's uncontestable in terms of generating card advantage. And so my approach to the mirror is, well, mirror being other decks that are trying not to make the game about tempo, is to force the game to be about quantity and having a way to trump the quantity game. I'm not sure to what extent that addresses it as a mirror, but I'd say that's like philosophically how I'm approaching mid-range in the format. Is there such a thing as too grindy? What's the minimum amount of late game threats? So the ways that you can be too grindy are either not having a way to close a game such that you deck yourself, or not having enough things to impact the board such that you get run over. And my approach to avoiding that problem is to not prioritize cards like Forbidden Alchemy and Deep Analysis that grind by drawing cards, and instead to prioritize creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities such that I'm playing to the board, and as long as I've answered my opponent's stuff, I can attack them with whatever bodies I happen to have, and I'm less likely to get run over because the bodies that are incidentally being played can trade with my opponent's bodies when my opponent is aggressive. So I think that the easy way to be too grindy is to insufficiently prioritize material advantage in terms of like board presence by over prioritizing like actual card draw. And while there are efficient card draw spells plus efficient removal, and that's like generally a pretty good plan, I think that it doesn't line. I think that like trying to play a bunch of Deep Analysis and Agony Warps lines up really poorly against an opponent who's just playing a bunch of Militia Buglers. So I prefer to be in as much on the Bugler side of that like dynamic as possible. Yeah, make sure that your card advantage is in the form of like creatures rather than card draw spells is the way to like minimize the risk of being too grindy. As far as like minimum amount of late game threats, that I don't know if there's a raw number there, because like, you know, Eternal Witness, for example, basically counts as late game threat in terms of like, have I hit a necessary number to be able to end the game? Yeah, the counts on that kind of stuff is always weird. It's like the like, you know, what's the minimum creature count? Where it's like, well, it kind of depends on like whether you can just like win in some way other than creatures. Like, are you casting a Villainous Wealth at some point? And like, how sticky are your creatures and how much recursion do you have and stuff like that. So I don't think I want to try to give like a number like you need 5 late game threats or whatever. I've seen some games where an opponent tried to go under your value and it looked like a total mismatch. Is there a counter in this format? Is there like a rock, paper, scissors more simply? And then another question that's very similar, what's the best way to beat this archetype? When I started drafting this format, I was struggling to trophy. I was going 2-1 very consistently, and I would play a Grixis control deck that had a bunch of efficient removal and some card draw, and it would line up well against the Boros aggro decks, but poorly against the big green Altasaur decks, because my small removal wouldn't be able to answer their big threats, and their green cards would give enough card advantage that I would just end up falling behind. I would end up finding mismatches and feel like it was hard to cover all of the possible opponents I would run into. Since switching my approach and basically since realizing that Settle Beyond Reality is the best common, I don't think I've lost a match. I'm sure that there is an archetype that's more likely to beat this than another archetype, and I'm sure that I will lose a match eventually if I play this. But I haven't drafted the format enough and forced this long enough to have a great sense of what its exact shortcomings are. And I really am not trying to say this is unbeatable, just follow this and you'll win all your matches, because obviously your opponent might also be listening to this. And also it's just not true. Sometimes you're going to play against some bomb that beats you, and sometimes an aggro deck will have a great draw or whatever. As far as just this is good against these archetypes and bad against this one archetype, the way that I think Grixis control fundamentally has a hole against big green, I don't know the hole in this strategy. I think it's just fundamentally very sound. I think that it plays the best cards and uses them synergistically. And I think that as long as you can get some of the good value uncommons, everything kind of just flows pretty easily from there. I think that where you're going to struggle is if you just never see any of Wall of Omens, Muldrifter, Skinrender, Eternal Witness, Psychic Symbiont, really specifically those. If you just don't see any of those cards, then the power level of your settles change a lot in power level depending on how good your average flicker is. And if you routinely have the best of those, then your settles are awesome and the game's really easy. But if you don't have any of the premium stuff and you're just flickering Elvish Rejuvenators or Aether Snipes or something, it's nowhere near as strong. Similarly, sometimes you just won't see settle, and then you're still fundamentally a lot it's not the value creatures are only good if you can flicker them. They're good the first time you cast them also. You won't always see the pieces for this, and there are other strong cards in the format. And so I think that it is not even necessarily correct to draft this way every time. If you see just a really good card for a different plan, then you might want to pivot. You might want to do that instead. You might want to try to do some kind of hybrid thing. But I've been very happy when I've been able to be here, and I've been able to be here pretty consistently. How many people per table can the archetype support? Again, the archetype is more of a broad philosophy, rather, because you could have one person who's Bant and one person who's Mardu technically, and they're not really competing with each other, except they both want exactly settle or whatever. Maybe the Bant person doesn't end up with settles, but they end up with some blinks or something. I also just don't know, because I'm playing mostly on Magic Online, where I'm not playing in pod, so I don't really know what the other people at my table were drafting. It's very hard to know just what even counts as someone competing in my archetype and what happens if a lot of people are trying to do it. So I don't really know the answer to how many per table it can support. How many settles would you run at most in this archetype? Well, I had a deck with 4 of them, and it was awesome. I was really happy to draw them. The games where I drew all 4 were great. So I know that I am very happy to play 4, and it certainly doesn't feel like a 5th would have been bad. I do think that you need to make sure that your curve makes sense, and you need to make sure that you have like good early blockers and stuff like that. But it's not hard to imagine that I would like rather have another settle than another like any other expensive card, especially if my deck had like 2 Eternal Witnesses. I'm sure there are points where like the stuff that you're flickering is like not that great, such that you might prefer some other expensive card over a settle. But I haven't had an experience where I felt like I had too many of them, and it doesn't feel super likely that I'm going to have a problem of having too many of them if I draft them too highly or something. Are there particularly good pivots for this strategy if you're not seeing settles? Yeah, just pivot into the stuff you have. That's kind of the great thing about it is like, where I was just talking about like how the other green cards in Baldur's Gate fundamentally don't work if you don't have Myconids, because you need Myconid to like ramp you and stabilize so that you can cast the expensive green cards. It's the exact opposite situation here. All of the like cards that make your settles good are good, cheap cards that you want to play anyway. So if you don't have settles, just play the cards that you were drafting that are good by themselves anyway. I had a deck that didn't get settle that was like a Panharmonicon Blink deck, and I was worried about the fact that I didn't have settle. And I ended up doing some pretty good things with like Aether sniping my own value creatures with Panharmonicon in play. Incidentally, Panharmonicon Aether Snipe is like capsize with buyback for 3 mana, but at sorcery speed and can't bounce lands. But I didn't even ever end up doing exactly that. I would say, like, you can still use like Aether Snipe and Momentary Blink as replacement ways to get extra value out of your ETBs, but you don't even need to do that because, like, the opportunity cost on these ETBs is very low. They're just good cards. And so the pivot is just like find other removal, find other powerful cards, like other high impact cards, and play a normal game that has some value cards in it and be happy about it. So that's part of why it feels so safe to draft this way, is like the core philosophy here is just this is a format with good removal, and so creatures that give you their value up front are better than creatures that need to stay alive. Like Rafik of the Many is a card that I think is not very impressive in this format because it's so easy to kill, and it's only good if it lives. Whereas, like, Coiling Oracle is just like you played it and you generated some value, and it doesn't really matter what happens from there. You're just like happy. And so you just take all these cards that are just kind of like fundamentally good, and then you take cards that make them even better. And if you don't have the cards that make them even better, you still have a sound deck of cards that are fundamentally good. I think where you run into trouble is if you're like trying to draft around like Relief Captains and Sensor Splicers and these cards that are like only good if you are blinking them, rather than cards that are just like a good rate by themselves and then it's, extra good if you blink them. And so that's why I think that you generally don't want to like prioritize those cards, the ones that are like inefficient on their own. All right, I think that's going to wrap it up. Thanks everyone for tuning in. These formats, both Double Masters and Baldur's Gate, feel a little unusual, so my coverage of them is also a little bit unusual. I'm not sure exactly still where I'm going to go next. Hopefully I find some other things that are good and a little bit different, but we'll see what happens as far as how I figure out how to handle these this kind of weird time in limited Magic. But thanks for tuning in, and I will be back later in the week for another episode. Have a good next few days until I'm back for more, and bye for now.